The smell of quicklime. They say some houses are born cursed. Others become cursed when their foundations are laid on blood. But the white columns of Rosewood Manor, the grandest plantation in Rutherford County, Tennessee, hid something even worse than a curse. They hid intent. Cold, meticulous, businesslike intent. On humid nights when the cicadas screamed and the cotton leaves rustled like whispers of the dead, neighbors swore you could smell it drifting from the edges of the Chamberlain estate, not manure, not smoke from the fields. Something sharper, sour on the tongue, clinging to the throat like an accusation. A smell too clean to belong in the wild, too harsh to belong on a farm. The smell of quicklime. Most folks dismissed it, telling themselves it came from the tannery upriver, or maybe from a burned-out farmhouse turned to ash by passing Confederate raiders. But the ones who worked closest to Rosewood Manor knew better. They said if you stood downwind at night, the odor clung to your clothes until morning. You could scrub your skin raw, but you'd still catch a ghost of it in your nose when you tried to sleep. That smell wasn't just the stench of chemicals. It was the smell of erasure. By the spring of 1863, whispers had already begun to creep into the taverns and churchyards of Rutherford County. Not whispers of the war. Everyone already knew about the war. Gettysburg, Antietam, the steady grind of bodies north and south. No, these whispers were quieter, more local, and far more dangerous to repeat. That workers who went to Rosewood Manor didn't come back. The gilded fortress. Rosewood didn't look like a place where men and women simply vanished. In fact, it was almost offensively beautiful. Built in 1834, the mansion had been carved into the landscape as if to taunt the surrounding countryside. Its 6 Corinthian columns stood so tall they caught the morning sun before anything else. On the horizon, whitewashed walls gleamed like polished bone, and the double-tiered wraparound galleries gave the impression of an ocean liner sailing above a green sea of cotton. The Chamberlains were proud of that illusion. Ezekiel Chamberlain most of all. At 42, Ezekiel had inherited more than acreage from his father Josiah. He had inherited the rare genius of opportunism. While other planters cursed the Union blockade and Confederate requisitions, Ezekiel doubled his profits by playing both sides. He sold cotton to Confederate quartermasters, then lost the shipments to Union troops and resold them at twice the price. To the desperate, it looked like magic. To Ezekiel, it was merely arithmetic, and yet arithmetic alone could not explain how Rosewood thrived while every neighboring plantation withered. Cotton yields required hands, calloused, weary, sunburnt hands, and those hands had fled toward Union lines, leaving fields fallow. But at Rosewood, neat rows of white fiber still stretched to the horizon, tended by men and women no one could quite account for. They appeared at dawn. They disappeared at dusk, always in hats and head wraps, their faces swallowed by shadow. Strangers. Silent strangers, an honest widow's worry. The story of Rosewood's undoing began, innocently enough, with a woman who refused to stop asking questions. Martha Henley was a widow from Murfreesboro. Her brother Thomas, a blacksmith, had taken work at Rosewood in the fall of '62. Thomas was a reliable man, steady as the anvil he worked. He hadn't touched liquor in 7 years, not since their father drank himself into an early grave. Before leaving for the plantation, Thomas promised Martha he'd write as soon as he received his first month's wages. 6 weeks passed, then 8. No letter. Martha rode to Rosewood herself, skirts dusty from the 20-mile journey. She was met not by Thomas, but by Daniel Chamberlain, the elder of Ezekiel's twin sons. Thin, nervous, forever pushing his spectacles up the bridge of his nose, Daniel had a habit of smiling without warmth. He told Martha her brother had been dismissed for drinking, that he'd stolen tools from the forge, that witnesses had seen him drunk behind the cotton gin. Martha had stared at him, her weathered hands trembling around the daguerreotype of her brother. "That ain't possible," she whispered. Thomas swore on Papa's grave. Daniel only smiled, produced a paper with signatures, his own, his brother Samuel's, and that of a field hand named Moses Washington. All neat, all official. Then he tucked it away as if the matter were closed. But Martha wasn't a woman who closed matters easily. She rode straight to Sheriff Coleman Briggs, clutching the photograph like scripture. Briggs had known Thomas Henley, had bought nails from him in town. The story didn't sit right. Thomas had been many things, but a thief, a drunk, it didn't match. The sheriff promised Martha he'd look into it. A visit to Rosewood. When Sheriff Briggs arrived at Rosewood that afternoon, Ezekiel Chamberlain was already waiting on the front steps in his finest black suit. It was almost as if he had been expecting him. Ledger in hand, Ezekiel greeted the sheriff with polished courtesy. "I anticipated your arrival," he said, offering the same explanation his son had given Martha. "Theft, whiskey, a dismissal regrettably necessary, for order." The sheriff examined the papers. The handwriting was clean, the signatures familiar, the dates tidy. Everything matched, too perfectly. And then he noticed it. That smell, faint but insistent, clinging to the air around the outbuildings, sharp, chemical, out of place. Like the tannery in town, but stronger, more caustic. Briggs said nothing. He tucked the papers into his coat. But as he rode away, unease gnawed at him. Ezekiel's answers had been too polished, his eyes too steady. And that smell, he couldn't shake. 3 days later, Martha Henley's body was found floating in the Stones River. Her horse grazed peacefully nearby. The coroner called it an accident, swift current, slipped from the saddle, but her reticule was missing. So was the photograph of her brother. Sheriff Briggs said nothing. But deep down he knew. Accidents did not tidy themselves so neatly. A pattern. In disappearances, winter passed into spring and the disappearances multiplied. A carpenter from Shelbyville, a seamstress from Nashville, a whole family, the Freemans, last seen heading toward Rosewood with their wagon piled high, hopeful for wages and stability. None were heard from again. Each time Briggs asked questions, Ezekiel produced documents, violations, abandonments, theft, always signed, always witnessed. Always just convincing enough to close the file, but not convincing enough to silence the whispers. Among the first to sense something rotten was Josiah Creek, Rosewood's head overseer. Creek was a mountain of a man, shoulders like oak beams, face carved by decades in the sun. He had enforced his share of cruelty. It came with the job. But what he noticed now chilled even him. By Daniel Chamberlain's meticulous records, 67 workers were on the books. But when Creek counted the faces in the fields, he never saw more than 39. The math didn't lie. 28 souls were missing, and yet the food stores lasted too long. The rations stretched too far. The numbers on the page didn't match the bodies in the field. That smell lingered too. Stronger at night. Stronger after certain workers vanished. Creek began to watch. The midnight procession. On a damp April night, mist rising from the fields, Creek saw lanterns moving through the workers' quarters at 2 a.m. Daniel and Samuel Chamberlain. Always together, always with them, 2 pale strangers, gaunt, educated men who didn't belong among cotton pickers. They carried leather satchels that rattled with instruments. Surgical instruments, Creek guessed. That night they entered the cabin of Benjamin Carver, a free black man from Memphis who'd been asking too many questions. Carver had been sharp-eyed, suspicious, muttering about missing co-workers. The brothers, left 20 minutes later, struggling under the weight of a canvas sack, dark stains spreading across the cloth. Creek followed at a distance, heart pounding, until they reached the family cemetery. But instead of burying the sack among the polished Chamberlain headstones, they passed beyond into the woods. There, torchlight revealed a shallow pit. The strangers poured liquid from a glass bottle onto the contents of the sack. The smell hit Creek like a slap. Quicklime, eating away flesh and bone. Ezekiel Chamberlain himself stood above the grave. His voice carried low but clear. 73. Souls to build an empire, each one a brick in our foundation. Creek's stomach lurched. When the grave was covered, the family split. Ezekiel backed toward the house. The brothers and strangers toward a barn Creek had always thought housed equipment, but that night curiosity drowned out fear. He followed them to the barn, and what he saw through a crack in the boards stole the last of his innocence. Inside, long vats bubbled with quicklime. Wooden paddles leaned against the walls used for stirring. Tables overflowed with sorted belongings, jewelry, tools, clothing. A furnace glowed, melting gold and silver into anonymous bars. And on a desk lay ledger books, Daniel's neat copperplate, handwriting listing victims like inventory, names, dates, possessions, values. Creek's eyes snagged on familiar items, Henley's tool belt, the Freeman family's rings, the seamstress's silver locket. The smell clawed at his throat. His chest heaved with silent fury. Then his boot snapped a board underfoot. Inside the barn, voices fell silent. Footsteps approached the door. Daniel's voice sliced the night. "Who's out there? Samuel, take the dogs, make sure they don't get away." The hounds erupted in howls. Creek bolted into the dark, lungs burning, heart hammering, every shadow a threat. Behind him, the Chamberlains had unleashed the hunt. And he knew, if they caught him, he would be ledger entry number 74. Creek crashes through the underbrush, the baying of bloodhounds closing in. His only advantage, 30 years of knowing every fence line and creek bed of Rosewood. But as the ground gives way beneath him and his leg snaps in a shallow ravine, he realizes the Chamberlains are not just hunting him. They are closing in to erase the one man alive who knows their secret. The overseer's flight, the ravine Josiah. Creek's breath rattled in his chest, torn between agony and desperation. When his boot caught the slick moss of the fallen log and pitched him headlong into the ravine, the sound of bone snapping carried louder in his mind than the hounds behind him. Pain knifed up his leg, white-hot, threatening to steal his consciousness. Above him, lanterns bobbed. Men's voices barked, "Orders." Samuel Chamberlain's baritone carried sharp through the night air. "He's down there, the dogs have him." Creek pressed his body into the mud, every nerve screaming as the baying grew louder. He had spent his life enforcing others' fear. Tonight, he was learning what it meant to be prey. But fate, fickle as a gambler's coin, sent him an ally from the shadows. The stranger and Blue Corporal William Hayes had been watching Rosewood Manor for 3 days, perched silent in the dense timber east of the plantation. A Union scout, barely 23, he was no stranger to the stench of war. He'd seen men gutted on bayonets, heard the gurgle of lungs filling with blood. But nothing unsettled him like Rosewood. It was too busy. Too many wagons arriving after dusk, too many pale-faced workers who never seemed to last long. And the smell, God help him, the smell, drifting even into the timberline where he lay hidden. So when the dog's frenzied cries ripped through the night, Hayes rose, rifle ready. He followed the commotion and found Creek half buried in mud, leg bent wrong, eyes wild. For a moment, Hayes thought the massive man must be a Confederate deserter or runaway, but the words that tumbled from Creek's cracked lips froze him in place. "They're killing folks, not just one. Scores. 73 buried already. Ledger books, quicklime. I seen it with my own eyes." Hayes stared, disbelief warring, with instinct. But then the dog's howls crested the ravine ridge. No time for doubt. He slung Creek over his shoulder, the overseer's bulk near crushing him, and staggered into the trees. Behind them, Samuel's voice thundered, "Don't let him leave these woods alive." The ride to Nashville, every hoofbeat of Hayes's horse was a drumbeat against death. Creek drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling names. Thomas Henley, the Freemans, the Irish girl with the silver locket. Each name another nail in Rosewood's coffin. Hayes had orders not to interfere, only to observe and report Confederate movements. But orders meant nothing when a man heard 73 unmarked graves whispered like a confession. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Nashville where Union tents stretched like white scars across the hills. Hayes delivered Creek, broken, leg-fevered mind and all, to the provost marshal. The first reaction was predictable laughter. A plantation turned slaughterhouse. Impossible. Hayes bristled, but Creek's words didn't falter. He described the vats, the smell, the ledger, even the placement of the family cemetery oak where graves stretched into the woods like veins from a diseased heart. The marshal stopped laughing. He sent word up the chain. The Chamberlain's plan. Their legacy back at Rosewood, Ezekiel Chamberlain, was already 3 moves ahead. That was his genius, to sense threats before they fully formed. By sunrise, he knew Creek had escaped. A stable hand, paid in coin and promises, had watched the Union scout carry the overseer away. Ezekiel convened his family in the great dining hall, sunlight spilling across the mahogany table. Margaret, his wife, sat with account books before her, eyes sharp as bayonets. Daniel adjusted his spectacles, hands ink-stained from his ledgers. Samuel leaned against the mantel, arms folded, restless as always. "They'll come," Ezekiel said, voice low, cultured. "Not because they believe him yet, but because men in power cannot resist when someone whispers of buried treasure." "You mean bodies," Margaret corrected. "I mean ledgers," Ezekiel replied smoothly. "And the goods they record. Gold melted into bars, jewelry enough to buy regiments. They will not come for justice, they will come for profit." He rose, gray eyes cutting to each of his kin. "We must be ready to vanish. Our dynasty cannot end in these hills. The war is but a storm. Storms pass, fortunes endure." Daniel licked his lips. "Father, the records, my ledgers, are the cornerstone of our legacy," Ezekiel interrupted. "But a cornerstone can become a noose. You will prepare a duplicate, one for us to carry forward, one for them to find. A diversion." Margaret closed her book. "And the overseer?" Samuel's smile was wolfish. "If he limps into a courtroom, I'll silence him there." Ezekiel shook his head. "No, son. His survival buys us time. Time to relocate, to prepare. We are not brutes. We are architects, and architecture demands patience." The family fell silent. In the stillness, the faint odor of lime drifted in through the shutters, clinging to the silk curtains as though the house itself exhaled guilt. The federal investigation major general, Rosecrans, was not a sentimental man. He had little time for ghost stories when Union soldiers were dying by the thousands. But Creek's testimony was too specific to ignore. Maps marked with X's, names matched to missing persons. Even details about the Chamberlain's strange associates, the pale brothers with surgical hands. A company of infantry was dispatched. They approached Rosewood on May 15, 1863, boots heavy in the churned soil, rifles gleaming in morning light. Creek, his leg bound and splinted, rode in a wagon at their head. He guided them with the precision of a man leading others back to his own nightmares. Past the cotton fields, past the stately gates to the barn, the doors were thrown open, and there it was. Vats of lime still bubbling faintly, piles of belongings neatly organized, ledger books splayed across a desk, Daniel's copperplate listing, victims like livestock, Thomas Henley, tools and silver watch, 47, Eleanor Walsh, sewing supplies, locket, 23, Freeman family, wagon, rings, household goods, 156. The soldiers, hardened by war, went pale. One bent over and vomited. Another whispered scripture, but Rosewood was empty of life. The Chamberlains were gone, horses missing, valuables stripped. Only the stink of chemicals remained, clinging like accusation. The false trail, in the days that followed, Union men dug where Creek pointed. One grave, then another, then another. Shallow pits lined with stakes, each number matching Daniel's pages. The lime had done its work, most bodies gone to slurry and fragments. But rings, belt buckles, scraps of fabric emerged. Enough to confirm the nightmare, enough to turn whispers into fact. Yet when word spread, so too did confusion. For among the ledgers were names of men still alive. One victim had been spotted in Memphis, Another, a deserter, was known to fight for the Confederates. Daniel's duplicate book had done its work. Truth blurred with falsehood. Skeptics claimed Creek had exaggerated. Perhaps the Chamberlains had fled because of debt, not murder. Perhaps Rosewood's stink was just war paranoia. But Creek knew better. He knew what he'd seen. The dogs. The sack. The oak. He knew. And his knowing painted a target on his back. Creek's new burden in the weeks that followed, Creek found no peace. His leg healed crooked, leaving him with a limp. He testified before officers, repeated the same story until his throat cracked. But each night, he woke drenched in sweat, hearing the scrape of paddles in lime, smelling the sharp bite of chemistry in his nostrils. Neighbors began to look at him strangely. Some whispered he had invented the tale to save himself from Confederate accusations. Others avoided him altogether as if the stink of Rosewood clung to him like a ghost. Worse, Creek noticed shadows on the road when he traveled. Figures just out of sight. A rider glimpsed cresting a hill, then gone. A stranger at the tavern who left the moment Creek entered. The Chamberlains were not finished with him. One night, as he sat alone by lamplight, he found a scrap of paper slipped under his door. No words, only a number, written in fine copperplate. Creek's hand trembled as he held the paper, heart hammering against his ribs. They hadn't abandoned him. They hadn't abandoned Tennessee. The Chamberlains were still watching, still counting, still building their dynasty in the shadows. And if 73 souls had built their fortune, Creek now understood with chilling clarity, he was meant to be the 74th. The Chamberlains may have vanished into the fog of war, but their reach is long, their ledger still open. Creek is not free, he's marked. The Dynasty in Exile, a Vanishing Act by June of 1863. Rosewood Manor was an empty shell. Soldiers slept in its rooms, their boots muddying imported rugs, their breath frosting the crystal chandeliers. The Union flag snapped above the roofline. But for all its military presence, the house felt hollow. The Chamberlains had slipped through the cracks of war like smoke through floorboards. Rumors spread quickly. Sightings in Mississippi. Whispers of passage downriver to New Orleans. Talk of forged papers and Confederate sympathizers who smuggled them away. What made the rumors more terrifying was their consistency. Always the family appeared whole. Ezekiel with his silver hair, Margaret like a hawk in silk, Daniel clutching his books, Samuel looming with his heavy fists. They were never fractured, never vulnerable. A dynasty doesn't scatter, it relocates. Creek's haunting Josiah. Creek might have thought survival would bring relief, but it brought only new burdens. He limped through life with the weight of 73 voices pressing on his chest. At night he dreamed of vats bubbling with acid-white froth, but sometimes the dreams turned stranger. He would see fields of cotton where every bowl was a human, eye staring at him, unblinking, waiting for his testimony. By day, whispers followed him. In Nashville taverns, men leaned closer when he entered. That's him, the overseer who betrayed his masters. Some said he was brave, others that he was complicit, a man who must have known too much for too long. Creek could never quite defend himself, because both things were true. One evening, a freedman named Moses Washington, the same man whose signature had appeared on Chamberlain forgeries, approached Creek with trembling hands. "I never signed them papers," Moses swore. "Daniel tricked me, told me it was supply orders. I swear on my soul I didn't witness no theft." Creek believed him. But the damage was done. The Chamberlains hadn't just erased bodies. They'd smeared reputations. Even the living became ghosts of themselves, and then came the letters, slipped under doors, left in saddlebags. Each marked only with a number in Daniel's delicate copperplate. It was as if the Chamberlains were still counting, still cataloging, and Creek was tangled in their ledger whether he lived or not. New Orleans south along the Mississippi, a different story was unfolding. In New Orleans, chaos reigned. Union occupation had left merchants desperate, dock workers restless, soldiers drunk on cheap liquor. In that chaos, a new name began to surface in gambling dens and boarding houses: the Fairchilds. a genteel family from Virginia investing in cotton futures. They rented a fine house in the French Quarter. The patriarch, Richard Fairchild, was tall, silver-haired with the bearing of aristocracy. His wife, Marianne, kept meticulous accounts. Their two sons, Edwin and Stephen, shadowed him like twin dogs, but the Fairchild's accent slipped sometimes, betraying Tennessee roots. Their silver coins bore the mint marks of Nashville banks, and those who worked for them, dockhands, seamstresses, carpenters, sometimes failed to return home. One woman in the quarter swore her brother had gone to work for the Fairchilds and never returned. Another claimed she smelled a chemical stench when passing their courtyard at night, as if bleach had been poured by the gallon. But no one dared pry too closely. In wartime New Orleans, disappearances were common. Soldiers conscripted men by force. Yellow fever claimed the weak. And money, especially money with the polish of Southern refinement, was a powerful silencer. If the Chamberlains had fled Tennessee, it seemed they had not abandoned their methods. They had simply changed their name. The investigator word of these disappearances eventually reached Union authorities. Not generals, they were too busy with battles, but a civilian investigator named Elias McGraw, a former newspaperman turned government agent. McGraw had an eye for patterns others ignored. When he heard about the Chamberlain case in Tennessee, the ledger books, the lime pits, the vanished family, he filed the story in his mind. And when months later, reports surfaced from New Orleans about the Fairchilds, he felt the shiver of recognition. McGraw sought out Josiah Creek, who sat at a Nashville tavern nursing a whiskey with his bad leg stretched before him. "You testified about 73 souls," McGraw said without introduction. "Did you ever hear talk of where the Chamberlains might go next?" Creek's hand froze around his glass. "They're not gone," he said flatly. "They're moving, that's all, like a cotton rot that finds new fields." McGraw leaned closer. "What if I told you there are new graves in New Orleans?" Creek's face twisted. His nightmares had already told him as much. Now the waking world confirmed it. Margaret's doctrine. Meanwhile, inside the Fairchild household in New Orleans, Margaret Chamberlain, now Marianne Fairchild, drafted what could only be called doctrine. While Ezekiel plotted profits and Daniel recorded possessions, Margaret wrote with the mind of a strategist. Her leather-bound notebook contained rules. Never take the prominent, only the marginal. Never harvest too quickly in one place. Leave breathing space for suspicion to cool. Always reward accomplices just enough to secure their silence. And above all, keep records. Posterity requires order. She did not see herself as a murderer, nor even a thief. She saw herself as an administrator of destiny, ensuring the Chamberlain line endured beyond war. Samuel, her violent son, grew restless with her rules. He wanted to expand, to take more boldly, but Margaret's discipline kept the operation from collapse. They were not thugs, she reminded him. They were builders, dynasts. It was her precision, the same precision that once measured candle stubs in Rosewood, that transformed mass murder into legacy. Creek's returned to the ashes haunted. By McGraw's words, Creek returned to the ruins of Rosewood under escort. The house still stood, though stripped of finery, its windows blank as sockets. The barn was sealed, the lime vats emptied, but the ground, he swore, still breathed. As he limped through the fields, he heard the rustle of cotton leaves, though there was no wind. He smelled lime, though the vats were gone, and in the old family cemetery he found something the soldiers had missed. A fresh stake hammered into the ground, bearing no number. Only a single word carved deep, awaiting. Creek staggered back, bile rising in his throat. Whether it was left by Chamberlains or by copycats emboldened by their myth, it didn't matter. The message was clear. The graves would not stop at 73. That night, as Creek tried to sleep, he dreamed he was back in the barn. But this time, he wasn't peering through a crack in the boards. He was inside, ledger open before him, his own name inked neatly across the page. When he jolted awake, sweat-soaked and gasping, He found something on his table. Not a dream. A real scrap of paper, in copperplate handwriting. Day 8. The Chamberlains' reach is no longer confined to Tennessee. Their dynasty is spreading, perhaps even multiplying. And wherever they go, the ledger continues to count, with Creek's life still dangling on the edge of their arithmetic. The Masques of New Orleans, the city of masks, New Orleans in 1864, was a city of contradictions. Union soldiers patrolled the levees, with rifles gleaming in the sun, but in the French Quarter, the gas lamps burned as if no war raged beyond its streets. Jazz filtered from taverns, perfumed women glided in silk, gamblers shouted over green baize tables. It was a place where you could vanish, or reinvent yourself. The Chamberlains knew this. As the Fairchilds, they became patrons of the opera, investors in river trade, donors to church charities. Their household hosted soirees where generals toasted champagne, and Creole belles blushed under crystal chandeliers. And yet in the alleys behind their house, washerwomen whispered about a smell, sharp, acrid, familiar to anyone who had scrubbed. Linens with too much lime. McGraw's Hunt Elias McGraw moved through the city with the eyes of a newspaperman and the patience of a hunter. He had seen the Union's official files, testimony from Creek, inventories of the 73 graves. But officials had no appetite for more scandal. They preferred the Chamberlains to be a closed chapter. McGraw disagreed. Evil, unpunished, never closed. It spread. He began shadowing the Fairchilds. He noted how their servants changed every few weeks, how dock workers who hauled their crates never returned for a second job, how Daniel, now Edwin Fairchild, was often seen purchasing lime in bulk, always paying in coin. But suspicion wasn't proof, and McGraw needed more than whispers if he meant to expose a family that had learned how to look untouchable. Creeks returned to the fray. Meanwhile, Josiah Creek tried to disappear into obscurity. He returned to his small cabin outside Murfreesboro, living with his limp, trying to drown his nights in whiskey. But sleep offered no mercy. In dreams, he saw ledger pages turning endlessly, each one blank except for a single word scrawled in copperplate. Awaiting. When McGraw found him in the summer of 1864, Creek nearly slammed the door in his face. "I gave my testimony," Creek growled. "I've no more to give." But McGraw laid down a letter, intercepted from a Union courier. It bore only a number, written in Daniel's hand. "Tell me, Mr. Creek," McGraw said softly, "how many more names will they add before you decide to stand again?" Creek's hands shook as he touched the page. He realized the truth. As long as the Chamberlains wrote numbers, he was already part of their book. Reluctantly, he agreed to travel to New Orleans. Margaret's mask inside the Fairchild household. Margaret played her role to perfection. She hosted teas where Union colonels flirted with her genteel reserve. She oversaw charity drives for war widows, distributing coin with the same precise hand that once rationed molasses at Rosewood. What none of her guests saw were the notebooks hidden beneath her parlor desk. Her doctrine had grown. Now she wrote of expansion, networks that could reach into river towns, boarding houses, even army camps. Her words were chilling in their calmness. Displacement breeds opportunity. The desperate always return for wages. Our prosperity must be written in silence. She did not think of it as murder. She thought of it as management. Samuel's impulse, but not every Chamberlain shared her discipline. Samuel, the brute son now, called Stephen Fairchild, grew restless with restraint. He prowled the riverfront at night, picking fights with dockhands, indulging in violence too public for comfort. One night he returned home with blood still on his knuckles and a wild light in his eyes. "Let me take them in the open, mother," he snarled. "No more whispers. Let them know our name means fear." Margaret slapped him, the sound sharp as a pistol crack. "Our name," she hissed, "means dynasty. You will not squander it on tantrums." Samuel's eyes burned, but he obeyed. Barely. McGraw's breakthrough. McGraw's chance came when a seamstress vanished, a young woman named Clara O'Donnell, who had been hired to alter gowns for Marianne Fairchild. Her boarding house mistress swore Clara left with a sewing kit and never returned. McGraw bribed a servant in the Fairchild household, a Creole boy barely 15. The boy whispered of barrels in the cellar, of harsh-smelling chemicals, of a locked room no servant was allowed to enter. It was enough. McGraw convinced Union authorities to raid the Fairchild home. Soldiers stormed the mansion at dawn. They found barrels of lime. They found crates of personal belongings, lockets, tools, trinkets. They found ledger pages, though some were half-burned in the hearth. But they did not find the Chamberlains. The family had vanished once again, slipping away into the river fog hours before. Only servants remained, trembling and confused. The curse of the ledger for Creek. The raid brought no relief. He stood in the gutted parlor, staring at the half-burned ledger. His eyes caught the last name still legible before the ink charred, Clara O'Donnell. Beside it, Daniel had written a number. Creek felt the floor tilt beneath him. It wasn't just that the Chamberlains killed. It was that they documented every life taken, as if bookkeeping was the true act, and murder only a step along the way. They were building something beyond cotton, beyond money. They were building permanence. That night, back in his rented room, Creek awoke to a soft scratching sound. He lit a lamp. On the inside of his window pane, drawn in condensation by a finger from the outside, was a single number. The Chamberlains hadn't just escaped. They were close enough to touch his glass. The Chamberlains are proving themselves untouchable, every escape more polished, every ledger entry more haunting. And now Creek realizes the dynasty's shadow is no longer distant. It is stalking him personally through the fog of New Orleans. The network of shadows, the vanishing family. After the New Orleans raid, the Chamberlains were declared fugitives in absentia. Wanted posters bearing the Fairchild name were plastered in river towns from Baton Rouge to St. Louis. Rewards promised silver and land for their capture. Yet like smoke slipping through boards, they were never caught. Reports came in fits. A silver-haired man seen boarding a riverboat under the name Richard Faulkner, two brothers glimpsed in Memphis taverns, a woman matching Marianne's description leaving a Catholic church in Natchez. Always possible, never provable. It was as if they weren't running from the world, but seeding themselves through it. Creek's doubt Josiah Creek, limping through the French Quarter with McGraw at his side, began to feel the futility. "You don't understand," Creek muttered one night, eyes hollow. "It don't matter if we find them, someone else will take up the work. They've shown the world how to do it." McGraw frowned. "You mean murder?" "No," Creek said, voice low. "Murder's old as Cain. I mean the system, the ledgers, the order of it. They've turned killing into accounting, and there are men out there who'll look at those profits and say, why not me?" Copycat soon enough. Creek's fear proved true. In Baton Rouge, investigators uncovered a plantation barn filled with vats, crude imitations of Rosewood's design. In Vicksburg, two brothers were hanged after being caught dissolving the body of a farmhand in lye. Neither case traced directly back to the Chamberlains. But both carried their echo. Newspapers began whispering of a cotton ledger conspiracy, a phrase that caught fire faster than soldiers' tobacco. Some dismissed it as hysteria, but others claimed to see its hand everywhere. The Chamberlains weren't just killers anymore. They were myth. Margaret's vision. Hidden in a river town, boarding house Margaret Chamberlain wrote feverishly by candlelight. Her sons argued in the next room. Ezekiel plotted routes and profits. But Margaret had transcended the particulars. She no longer thought in ledgers or acres. She thought in doctrine. Her writings, later found only in fragments, read like scripture, twisted into commerce. Blood is capital. Properly managed, it yields dividends. The nameless are the richest soil. They disappear easily. Family is the first dynasty, but dynasty must spread beyond blood. She was inventing something larger than her own clan. A blueprint for a network of operators who could keep the system alive long after her sons turned to dust. It wasn't survival she sought anymore. It was immortality. McGraw's revelation. Elias McGraw pieced this together slowly, following rumors, tracking strange disappearances across the Mississippi corridor. The pattern chilled him. The killings weren't random, nor were they always tied to profit. Some seemed ritualistic, numbers recorded, possessions sorted, lives erased with a consistency too familiar to be coincidence. In a New Orleans archive, McGraw uncovered a letter intercepted by Union censors. It was unsigned, written in elegant copperplate, and mailed from St. Louis. It read only, "To ensure prosperity, one must keep the count. The count is the root of dynasty." At the bottom was a number. McGraw realized with horror that even if the Chamberlains themselves were caught or killed, their doctrine had already escaped them. Others were adopting it. The Chamberlains had become more than fugitives. They had become an idea. Creek's breaking point for Creek, the weight grew unbearable. He'd thought exposing Rosewood would end the nightmare. Instead, it multiplied. Every new disappearance, every whispered number felt like a personal failure. One night he confessed to McGraw, "Maybe I should have died that night. Maybe I should have been 74. Then at least the book would have closed." McGraw seized his shoulder. "Don't you see? That's what they want. They want you to believe the ledger can't be broken. But it can." Creek stared at him, eyes wet. "You don't understand. They left me a page, McGraw. In my name. Written neat like the others. I'm already in the book." And then his voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if they're the ones writing. Or if I, A trap in St. Louis. The trail finally led them north to St. Louis, a booming city swollen with immigrants and soldiers. Here, dock workers began vanishing. Here, lime shipments arrived under false names. McGraw and Creek laid a trap. They posed as labor agents offering desperate men work with a new cotton broker, said to be hiring. Within days, word reached the ears of the Fairchilds, or whatever names they wore now. One fog-choked night, McGraw spotted them at last. Ezekiel, taller than the crowd, guiding his family down a dockside alley. Margaret close at his side. Daniel clutching a satchel. Samuel looming behind like a shadow. Creek's heart seized. Years of pursuit condensed into this single glimpse. But before soldiers could close the trap, the alley erupted in fire. Barrels exploded, flames clawed upward, screams filled the night. In the chaos, the Chamberlains vanished yet again, leaving only a satchel behind. Inside were ledger pages, neat, copper plate, unburned. The last entry read, Josiah Creek, awaiting. 87. As the flames consumed the alley, Creek stared at the page. His name wasn't a future threat anymore. It wasn't a number waiting to be filled. It was already entered. And when he looked up through the smoke, he swore he saw Ezekiel watching from the far side of the blaze, silver hair glowing in the firelight, eyes calm as a banker's. Then the figure was gone. The Chamberlains are no longer fugitives of flesh and blood alone. They are building a doctrine, a system that spreads like contagion. Creek realizes with horror that whether he lives or dies, he is already written into their book. The ledger eternal, the ashes of St. Louis, the fire on the dock smoldered for days. Authorities chalked it up to Confederate saboteurs, but McGraw and Creek knew the truth. The Chamberlains had burned their trail, as they always did. What chilled Creek most wasn't their escape, it was the satchel. The ledger page naming him awaiting 87. He hadn't been marked as a possibility. He'd been recorded as a certainty, and that was the genius of the Chamberlains' terror. They killed with knives and chemicals, but the ledger killed with inevitability. Once your name was written, you belonged to them, whether your body followed or not. Margaret's doctrine complete. In a boarding house attic outside St. Louis, Margaret Chamberlain gathered her family by lamplight. Around her lay trunks of ledgers, each meticulously bound, each containing the names of those erased. "This is not escape," she told them. "This is ascension. A dynasty does not live in stone houses or acres of cotton. It lives in records, in systems, in the order we impose on chaos." Daniel, pale and trembling, nodded. Samuel scowled but said nothing. Ezekiel closed his eyes, savoring her words like scripture. Margaret continued, her voice low but fervent. "When we are gone, others will read these books. They will see how it is done. They will carry it forward. The dynasty will not need our faces, only our doctrine." And for the first time, the family understood. They weren't simply evading justice, they were seeding a legacy. McGraw's pursuit. McGraw, obsessed, traced rumors along the river. Reports of lime shipments, of dockhands who vanished, of a woman, with Virginia poise buying ink by the gallon. He saw the pattern Margaret had written into being, not just isolated murders, but a network forming in river towns, each imitating the Rosewood model. Killers who cataloged, profiteers who justified, opportunists who adopted the system for themselves. "This isn't a family anymore," McGraw whispered to Creek one night. "It's a franchise of death." Creek shuddered. "And you can't hang a franchise." The confrontation, their chance, came in winter 1864. An informant, a terrified boy who once carried letters for Daniel, revealed that the Chamberlains planned to leave America altogether. Passage on a ship bound for Havana. From there, South America. McGraw and Creek intercepted them at a river landing outside Cairo, Illinois. Snow fell heavy, muting sound, cloaking shapes in white. Soldiers ringed the landing. For once, the Chamberlains were trapped. Ezekiel stepped forward, silver hair catching snowflakes. He did not look like a fugitive. He looked like a man greeting a guest at his parlor. "You think to cage us?" he said softly. "You cannot cage an idea." McGraw raised his pistol. "Your idea dies with you." But Margaret only smiled, her eyes like steel. "No, sir. It is already written." The firefight. The standoff broke like ice cracking. Samuel lunged first, firing wildly. Soldiers returned shots, the night exploding with thunder and flame. Daniel fell, clutching his chest, blood soaking the snow. Margaret screamed but did not run. Ezekiel moved with eerie calm, directing his family like a general. Creek, half lame, dragged himself through the chaos toward Margaret. He found her clutching a leather-bound volume, its pages fluttering in the wind. He wrested it from her hands, shouting over the gunfire, "It ends here!" But Margaret only whispered, lips close to his ear, "Not while men keep count." Then, a shot rang out. She crumpled in the snow, eyes wide, her doctrine unfinished. Ezekiel fell moments later, a bullet through his temple. Samuel charged until 5 rifles cut him down. The dynasty of flesh ended in a storm of smoke and lead, the ledger's secret. In the silence afterward, Creek opened the book Margaret had clutched. His breath froze. It was not a ledger of possessions. It was a ledger of names. Not only victims, but acolytes. Dozens of them. Dock workers, boarding house owners, traders, people who had adopted the system, trained under Chamberlain whispers, carried the doctrine forward. At the bottom of the page, a line in Daniel's copperplate read, "The dynasty is not bound by blood. It is bound by the count." Beneath it was a number. McGraw stared over Creek's shoulder. "It's not just them. It never was. They've already replicated." Creek felt the weight crush his chest. Killing the Chamberlains hadn't severed the root. It had scattered seeds. The final twist in the weeks that followed, the bodies of Ezekiel, Margaret, Daniel, and Samuel were buried in unmarked military graves. The case was declared closed. Newspapers announced the fall of the Rosewood killers. But Creek knew better. He had seen the names. He had seen the doctrine. One night, alone in his cabin, he opened the ledger again. He traced the copperplate with trembling fingers. His own name stared back at him, inked on a page no bullet could erase. Josiah Creek. 87, beneath it, in a hand not Daniel's but eerily similar, a new line had been added since the river landing, Elias McGraw, 89. Creek dropped the book, horror freezing his veins. Someone was still writing, not the Chamberlains, someone else. The dynasty had already survived them. And so the cotton fortune built on 73 graves became something larger than one family's crime. It became a doctrine that whispered through river towns, plantations, cities. A system that reduced human life to entries in a book. The Chamberlains were dead, but their idea lived on, carried by others who believed in the power of the count. To this day, in dusty courthouses and forgotten archives, copies of their ledgers surface, names inked in copperplate, numbers continuing long after the Chamberlain family vanished into the earth. No one knows who holds the pen now, but the count, they say, never stopped. The Chamberlains are killed, but their doctrine survives, spread like a plague. The ledger becomes eternal, names continuing to be written long after their deaths. Creek and McGraw discover too late that they themselves are already part of the count.